The flashing blue and red lights appeared suddenly in the mirror. It was supposed to be a quiet drive home, no crowd, no cameras, no premiere, no headlines, just a black SUV rolling steadily down an empty stretch of highway. Keanu Reeves adjusted his grip on the steering wheel and slowly eased the vehicle to the side of the road. Calm, measured, no sudden movements. He turned off the engine. The night air felt still. 2 patrol cars stopped behind him. That was unusual. For a minor traffic. "Stop! 2 cars!" He lowered the window and placed both hands visibly on the wheel. The first officer approached quickly, not casually, not routinely, but with urgency. License and registration. Now. The tone wasn't neutral. It was sharp. Keanu nodded and reached slowly toward the glove compartment. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer barked. Keanu froze mid-movement. "I'm just getting my registration," he said calmly. The second officer moved to the passenger side. Flashlight beams cut across his face. Inside the vehicle, across the dashboard, over his jacket. "Step. Out of the car!" There was no explanation, no mention of speeding, no broken taillight, no reason given at all. Keanu unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out slowly, keeping his hands visible. The gravel crunched under his boots. Before he could fully turn around, a hand grabbed his arm. Hard. "Spread your legs." The push came suddenly. "He's firm enough to throw him off balance." "I'm cooperating," Keanu said evenly, but the grip tightened. Another shove. "Stop resisting." He wasn't resisting. Passing cars slowed, headlights illuminated the scene, a phone camera appeared from a vehicle parked several yards away. The tension in the air thickened. The officers saw a man in a worn motorcycle jacket and dark jeans, unshaven. Quiet, composed. They did not see decades of discipline. They did not see years of martial arts training. They did not see someone known for patience under pressure. They saw someone they believed they could control, and in that moment, they made a decision. Because what happened in the next few seconds was no longer just a traffic stop. What would you do if a routine stop suddenly turned physical? The highway was nearly empty. A cold wind drifted across the open road, carrying the distant hum of passing engines. The flashing patrol lights reflected off the black paint of the SUV, turning the quiet roadside into a stage of blue and red shadows. Keanu Reeves stood still, hands visible, breathing steady. He had been through high-pressure situations before. Film sets, intense stunt training, long nights rehearsing action sequences for movies like John Wick and The Matrix. But this wasn't choreography. There were no stunt coordinators, no reset button. This was real. "Why was I pulled over?" he asked calmly. The first officer ignored the question. "Turn around." Keanu complied. The second officer stepped closer, shining a flashlight directly into his eyes. The beam lingered longer than necessary, almost testing his reaction. "Where are you coming from?" "Heading home," Keanu replied. "Home where?" The tone wasn't conversational. It was interrogative. A third patrol car drove past slowly, then continued on. For a brief second, it felt like someone had decided this stop mattered. One officer circled behind him, another stayed at his side. Their movements weren't coordinated. They were tense, reactive. "Are there any weapons?" "In the vehicle?" one asked. "No." "Any substances?" "No." "Then why are you nervous?" Keanu looked at him steadily. "I'm not nervous." But he understood something important in that moment. The officers weren't responding to behavior. They were responding to perception, his worn leather jacket, his quiet demeanor, the fact he was alone. No entourage, no publicist, no spotlight. To them, he was just another driver on a dark road, a driver they assumed they could dominate. One officer suddenly gripped his wrist again, twisting it slightly. "Higher than necessary during the search. I'm cooperating," Keanu repeated. "Stop talking." A vehicle slowed down behind the patrol cars. Someone inside began recording. The red recording light blinked faintly through the windshield, and that changed everything, because now there were witnesses. The officers' voices lowered, but their physical control didn't. "Why are you out this late?" one asked. It's not illegal to drive at night, Keanu answered calmly. That response seemed to irritate them more than silence would have. Authority challenged, even politely, often reacts defensively. The first officer stepped closer. You think you're smarter than us? Keanu said nothing this time. Silence can be powerful. But silence can also escalate someone looking for confrontation. Another shove. More force than necessary. The air shifted again. Keanu could feel it. That subtle tipping point where restraint and reaction stand inches apart. He had trained for years in controlled environments. Discipline, balance, precision, not aggression. He knew the difference between defending himself and escalating a situation. But he also knew something else. If control turns into excessive force, instinct takes over. The officer's grip tightened once more. Stop resisting! He still wasn't resisting, but the narrative was already forming in their minds. And that's when Keanu realized. This wasn't about a traffic violation anymore. It was about power. And power, when misused, can become unpredictable. The question was no longer why he had been stopped. The question was how far this would go. The grip on his wrist tightened again. Too tight. The officer pushed him forward, pressing him against the hood of the SUV. The metal was cold against his palms. I said, stop resisting! Keanu's jaw clenched slightly. Not in anger, but in restraint. I'm not resisting, he repeated, voice steady. But the words didn't matter. One officer positioned himself behind him. The other moved closer to his side. Their movements were quicker now, less measured. What had started as tension was turning into force. A passing car slowed almost to a stop. A window rolled down, a phone camera pointed directly at the scene. The flashing lights painted everything in harsh colors. Blue, red, shadow, glare. The moment felt suspended in time. The officer behind him suddenly attempted to force his arm higher up his back. It wasn't a standard hold anymore. It was aggressive. Pain shot through his shoulder. That was the first real signal. Not fear, not anger. Instinct. Keanu shifted his weight slightly. A small adjustment, subtle but intentional. Years of training had taught him balance first. Reaction. Second, the officer interpreted the shift as resistance. Get on the ground. A knee pressed into the back of his leg. Another push. The situation had officially crossed the line from control to confrontation. Keanu exhaled slowly. He had spent months training for controlled fight sequences, mastering discipline for films. Like John Wick, Chapter 2. But real-life defense wasn't about choreography. It was about minimal force. Just enough to create space. Another sudden jerk on his arm. That was it. Not a punch. Not an attack, a redirection. Keanu pivoted smoothly, using the officer's own momentum against him. A controlled twist, a shift of balance. The aggressive grip broke instantly. The officer stumbled backward, surprised. The second officer lunged forward. Keanu stepped aside, calm, precise, guiding the motion away rather than striking into it. A firm hold, a controlled displacement. Within seconds, both officers were off balance. No wild swings, no reckless blows, just discipline meeting aggression. The bystanders gasped. One voice shouted, "Whoa!" Phones were fully raised now. Recording, capturing every second. The officers stepped back, stunned. They hadn't expected resistance, especially not this kind. Not composed, not technical, not controlled. For a split second, no one moved. The flashing, lights continued to pulse across the road. One officer adjusted his stance, breathing heavier now. "You just assaulted an officer!" Keanu stood still. "No," he replied calmly. "I defended myself." His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't arrogant. It was factual. Backup sirens echoed faintly in the distance. More units were coming. The situation was shifting again, from physical to political. Because now there were witnesses. Now there was footage. Now there was a narrative that couldn't be shaped by words alone. The officers looked at each other, uncertain. They had initiated force, but the response had exposed something else entirely. Training, control, confidence without chaos, and most importantly, restraint. Keanu slowly lowered his hands, keeping them visible again. He didn't advance. He didn't threaten. He simply stood there, calm in the middle of flashing lights and rising tension. The road felt silent despite the sirens approaching. This wasn't about winning. It wasn't about dominance. It was about boundaries, and those boundaries had just been drawn. When does self-defense stop being resistance and start being survival? The sound of approaching sirens grew louder. Backup was arriving. 3 more patrol cars pulled up, tires crunching against the gravel shoulder. Doors opened quickly. More officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts, scanning the scene. From a distance, it looked like chaos. 2 officers slightly off balance. A civilian standing calm. Bystanders recording from across the road. But up close, something felt different. Keanu Reeves wasn't aggressive. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't even breathing heavily. He simply stood there, composed, alert, controlled. One of the newly arrived officers stepped forward. "What's going on here?" Before either of the original officers could answer, someone from the roadside called out, "They grabbed him first. It's on video." That shifted the energy instantly, because now this wasn't just an internal report. It was public. The first officer, still catching his breath, straightened his uniform. He resisted during a lawful stop. Keanu looked at him steadily. "I asked why I was being detained," he said calmly. "I complied. I was pushed." No emotion in his voice, just facts. The supervising officer studied him more closely now. The leather jacket, the boots, the posture. Then, his expression changed slightly. Recognition. He took a half step forward. "Sir, what's your name?" A pause. "Keanu Reeves." Silence. One of the backup officers blinked. "The actor?" Keanu didn't respond to that part. He simply held eye contact. The supervisor exhaled slowly. The tension in his shoulders lowered, but only slightly, because fame wasn't the real issue. Force was. The first officer tried again. He turned and threw me off. "I redirected you," Keanu corrected gently. "You were applying unnecessary pressure." The words were precise, measured, like someone trained to understand movement, not to misuse it. The supervisor glanced at the bystanders. "How many of you recorded this?" Several hands went up, phones still raised. Red recording lights blinking. That was the real turning point. Not recognition, not status, evidence. The power dynamic shifted, not because of who Keanu was, but because of what had been witnessed. The supervisor turned back to the original officers. "Did he strike you?" A brief hesitation. "No, but..." "Did he attempt to flee?" Another pause. "No." "Did he threaten you?" Silence. Again. The flashing lights continued to paint the road in restless color. Keanu adjusted his sleeve slightly, where the grip had left faint marks. "I never raised my voice," he said quietly. "I never resisted. I asked a question." The supervisor nodded once, to Keanu, then to his officers. "Body cams," he ordered. One by one, the officers reached to confirm they were recording. The realization settled in. This entire encounter was documented, not just from the roadside, but from their own uniforms. The first officer swallowed. His earlier aggression had faded, replaced by something else. Awareness. Because now the narrative wasn't theirs to control. It would be reviewed, analyzed, played, back frame by frame. And in those frames, one thing would be clear. The escalation didn't start with Keanu. It started with force. The supervisor stepped slightly closer to him. "Sir, we're going to review the footage. For now, I need you to remain here." Keanu nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." His calmness wasn't performative. It was disciplined, years of training, years of understanding when to act and when to stand still. The officers around him seemed smaller now, not physically, but emotionally, because confidence built on authority can crumble when confronted with composure. The bystanders whispered among themselves. "This is crazy." They had no reason. "Look how calm he is," And that calm was the loudest statement of all. Not a celebrity losing his temper, not a viral meltdown, just a man who knew his boundaries and refused to let them be crossed. The supervisor stepped back toward his team, voices lowered, short exchanges, serious faces. The road, once tense and explosive, had shifted into something heavier. Consequences. Because what had begun as a simple traffic stop had now become an internal review waiting to happen, and everyone standing there knew this wasn't over. The night no longer felt quiet. Even though the highway remained mostly empty, the atmosphere had changed. What began as flashing lights and raised voices had evolved into something heavier, something official. The supervising officer stepped aside with the two original officers. Their conversation was low but tense, short sentences, defensive tones, occasional glances toward Keanu. Across the road, bystanders were still filming. One of them spoke loudly enough to carry across the distance. They grabbed him first. "I saw it," another added. "He didn't even fight back. He just moved." That distinction mattered. He didn't attack. He redirected, and there was a difference. Keanu stood with his hands relaxed at his sides now. No sudden movements, no dramatic gestures, just steady breathing under the pulse of red and blue lights. The supervisor returned. "Sir, we're reviewing the body cam footage now." One of the officers had already begun scrolling through clips on a small mounted screen inside a patrol car. The footage was clear, audio included, the first minutes played back, the command tone. The shove, the grip on the wrist. "Stop resisting!" But the video showed something else. No struggle, no aggression, no attempt to flee. Just a man asking, calmly, "Why was I pulled over?" The supervisor's jaw tightened slightly, because now this wasn't about perception, it was about proof. One of the original officers spoke up defensively. He turned suddenly. The supervisor didn't look away from the screen. He turned after you forced his arm upward. Silence. The air felt different now, less explosive, more serious. Consequences don't shout, they settle. Keanu stepped closer, not confrontationally, but with quiet intention. "Am I being charged with anything?" he asked evenly. The supervisor paused the footage. "No, sir." The word "sir" came naturally now, not because of celebrity, but because of clarity. The supervisor faced his officers. "Why? Was the second unit called?" No immediate answer. He matched a vague description, one muttered. "Of what?" Another silence. The bystanders had moved slightly closer, still filming. The situation was no longer ambiguous. It was documented from multiple angles, and that meant the truth would not depend on a written report alone. Keanu looked toward the supervisor. "I don't need special treatment," he said calmly. "But I do expect fair treatment." The statement landed heavier than any accusation could have. Fair, not fame, not influence, not status, just fairness. The supervisor nodded once. "You're correct." He turned back toward the officers. "You initiated physical force before confirming." "Non-compliance." The first officer shifted uncomfortably. It was precautionary. "No," the supervisor said firmly. "It was premature," that word echoed. Premature, not justified, not necessary. Premature. A decision made too quickly. The supervisor looked back at Keanu. "We will be filing an internal review." The two original officers stiffened. "Effective immediately," the supervisor added. The weight of that sentence settled in the cold night air, because internal reviews meant paperwork, body cam audits, command scrutiny, possible suspension, and training, reassessment. The power dynamic had reversed completely. Not because Keanu fought harder, but because he remained controlled. He hadn't escalated, he hadn't shouted, he hadn't tried to intimidate, he had simply drawn a boundary, physically and calmly. And when the moment passed, he stepped back. That discipline was impossible to ignore. One of the bystanders called out again, "Let him go already!" The supervisor raised a hand toward the crowd, not aggressively, just to signal calm. He faced Keanu. "Sir, you're free to leave." Another pause. Then, more formally, "And I apologize for the conduct you experienced tonight." The first Officer avoided eye contact. The second stared at the ground. Keanu nodded once. I appreciate that. He didn't gloat. He didn't threaten legal action. He didn't demand names or badges. Instead, he said something unexpected. I hope this becomes a training moment. The supervisor blinked slightly. A training moment? Yes, Keanu said. Authority carries responsibility, especially when someone is cooperating. That was the bigger truth. This was never about a celebrity overpowering officers. It was about how quickly power can become force when assumptions replace communication. The flashing lights finally dimmed as engines shut off one by one. The road returned to darkness, quiet again, but not unchanged, because several people would go home that night replaying what happened. The officers, the bystanders, and the supervisor who now had paperwork waiting for him. Keanu walked back toward his SUV. Before opening the door, he paused and looked back once more. Not in anger, not in warning, but in acknowledgement. Moments like this ripple outward. Training manuals get rewritten, policies get reviewed, voices get heard, not because someone dominated, but because someone refused to be dominated unfairly. He got into the vehicle, closed the door, started the engine, and drove away calmly into the night. Behind him, flashing lights were replaced by reflection. The night had grown colder, but the tension on that roadside still lingered. The flashing lights painted the asphalt in constant staccato reds and blues, bouncing across the patrol cars and Keanu Reeves's dark leather jacket. Every shadow felt heavier than the last, as if the night itself were holding its breath. Keanu remained calm, standing beside his SUV. His hands rested naturally at his sides, fingers slightly curled, ready but not aggressive. The two officers who had initially grabbed him were now subdued, clearly unsure of what to do next. Their earlier confidence, which had fueled unnecessary force, had evaporated. The supervising officer, flanked by his backup units, stepped forward once more. His tone was firm but measured. Sir, we're concluding the review. Based on the evidence, there will be disciplinary action against the officers involved. Keanu nodded slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't smirk or appear satisfied. But his presence alone carried weight. Every movement, every breath radiated control. Years of martial arts training, decades in front of cameras, countless high-stakes stunts, all of it boiled down to one principle: discipline over aggression. I'm not here to see anyone punished. For fame, Keanu said quietly. I'm here to make sure authority is exercised responsibly. The supervisor's eyes shifted. He had expected outrage, threats, legal jargon, perhaps even a lawsuit, but none of that came. I understand, he said carefully. We will take all the necessary steps to ensure this incident is handled appropriately. Keanu looked directly at the original officers now. They avoided his gaze. There was no malice in his expression, just clarity. You need to understand, he said calmly. The moment you used force unnecessarily, you created a situation that could have escalated dangerously. You were accountable, and now that accountability will be visible. The first officer swallowed hard. The second shifted uncomfortably. Both seemed to comprehend the gravity of the lesson. It's not about punishment, Keanu continued. It's about awareness. About realizing that respect and procedure must come before assumption and force. You must treat every person, regardless of who they appear to be, with fairness and dignity. The words hung in the cold air, sharper than any siren, louder than any shout. The supervising officer finally spoke, his voice steadier than before. Sir, would you like to leave now? Keanu considered the question. He didn't hurry. Every decision he made was deliberate. He wanted the officers, and even the bystanders, to understand that restraint, not reaction, held power. I will leave, he said finally. But know this. This isn't just about tonight. It's about every interaction you will have moving forward. How you treat people when no one is watching defines your integrity. And when that is compromised, consequences follow, whether you are in uniform or in life. He stepped closer to his SUV. The officers instinctively stepped back. Their earlier aggression had been replaced with respect, though not out of fear, out of comprehension. Keanu paused at the driver's side door and looked over his shoulder. "I didn't come here to be recognized. I came here to ensure fairness. That's what should guide every action taken in positions of power." The supervisor nodded again, fully aware of the weight behind those words. He would report this properly. There would be internal reviews, mandatory training, changes to policy. The lesson was not lost. Keanu opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. The vehicle's leather creaked softly beneath him. He adjusted the mirror, checked the rear view, and started the engine. The patrol cars remained for a moment longer, flashing their lights. But the night had shifted. The lesson had been delivered not with force, but with calm authority and unshakable composure. As the SUV rolled away, the officers and supervisor stood silently on the roadside. They had seen firsthand the difference between power used for domination and power exercised with responsibility. The bystanders lowered their phones, still recording, but now with a deeper understanding of the event they had witnessed. This wasn't a story about a celebrity overpowering law enforcement. It was a story about respect, boundaries, and the consequences of unchecked authority. Keanu drove into the night, leaving behind flashing lights, unresolved questions, and a group of men who would remember this encounter for the rest of their careers. The lesson was clear. When authority is misused, calm accountability has the power to expose mistakes and reshape behavior. And sometimes, the strongest person in any room is the one who refuses to escalate, even when challenged. The night had finally settled, though the tension lingered like a faint vibration in the air. The flashing red and blue lights had dimmed, leaving only the quiet hum of engines and the occasional crunch of gravel under tired boots. Keanu Reeves sat in his SUV for a moment, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of what had just occurred. This wasn't a movie set. There were no retakes, no stunt doubles, no safety nets. Every second, every movement, every decision had been real. He looked out through the windshield at the officers standing on the roadside. Their posture had shifted from dominance to uncertainty to cautious respect. The two original officers, the ones who had initiated unnecessary force, remained silent, clearly processing the evening's events. One kept glancing at his partner, both avoiding eye contact with Keanu. Their earlier confidence had vanished. What had started as a routine traffic stop had become a lesson in restraint, discipline, and accountability. Keanu exhaled slowly. He didn't want to gloat. He didn't want confrontation. He didn't want headlines. His goal had been simple: ensure the situation ended fairly and make sure the misuse of authority would not go unchecked. The supervising officer approached once more. His expression was calmer, measured, and serious. He had already initiated internal protocols for review and training, but now he understood something deeper. Keanu wasn't just a celebrity. He was a mirror reflecting their behavior, a reminder that power carries responsibility. "Sir," the supervisor said quietly, "thank you for your patience. We will conduct a full review of the incident." Keanu nodded. "I appreciate that. But this isn't about me. It's about how authority is exercised, how people are treated when they are cooperating. That's what matters." The supervisor glanced at his officers, who were still visibly shaken. Keanu's words weren't a threat. They were clarity. Discipline, not force, had won this encounter, and it had left an impression that would last far beyond the roadside. A few bystanders had lingered, phones still recording. They whispered among themselves, replaying the moments they had captured. The scene had been tense, chaotic in its early seconds, but what they witnessed ultimately was something remarkable: control, calm, and accountability prevailing over unnecessary aggression. One of the original officers finally spoke, voice quiet. We didn't expect..." He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "You didn't expect me to remain calm?" Keanu asked gently. "No," the officer admitted. We acted too quickly." Keanu nodded. That was all he needed to hear. The lesson had been absorbed. "I hope this becomes more than a cautionary tale," he said. "It should become a training moment. Force should never be the first answer. Respect and procedure should always come first. Everyone here needs to understand that." The supervisor's expression softened. "Agreed. We will ensure this is included in our training programs moving forward." Keanu glanced back at the road behind him, at the patrol cars, at the officers. For a long moment there was silence. Not awkward, not tense, just understanding. He had set boundaries, maintained control, and refused to escalate. And that had been enough to change the course of the night. Then, without a word, he started the engine. The SUV's growl was low and steady, echoing in the quiet night. He drove slowly at first, giving the officers and the bystanders space to process, before gradually accelerating down the empty road. Behind him, flashing lights remained faintly in view, but the mood had shifted. What had been a confrontational, dangerous scenario was now a learning moment, not for spectacle, not for fame, but for understanding. Power misused can be dangerous, but power exercised responsibly has far-reaching effects. As Keanu disappeared into the distance, the officers returned to their vehicles. Conversations began, quieter now, reflective rather than defensive. The internal review had begun, but so had something more important: a recognition of responsibility, accountability, and respect. Even the bystanders who had recorded the encounter understood the real story. It wasn't about a celebrity defending himself. It was about someone calmly demonstrating the difference between aggression and discipline, authority and accountability. It was about showing that true strength lies in control, not domination. For Keanu, the night ended as quietly as it had begun. No press, no social media notifications, just a drive home under the stars, reflecting on how simple choices, restraint, composure, clarity, can reshape not only a single moment, but the behavior of those around you. And the message was clear. Authority can be challenged without chaos, respect can be demanded without anger, and discipline can teach lessons far more powerful than force. The next day, news of the incident spread, not through tabloids, not through gossip, but through discussions about responsibility and the right way to exercise authority. Officers were reminded of the importance of procedure. Supervisors took notes. Training programs were updated. And those who witnessed the event would never forget how a single, composed individual turned a potentially dangerous situation into a moment of accountability. Keanu Reeves hadn't sought recognition. He hadn't sought revenge. He had simply stood his ground with calm authority. And in doing so, he taught an entire group, officers, supervisors, bystanders, that true power lies not in force but in discipline. The road ahead remained quiet. The night air was cool, but the lesson would linger much longer than the sound of sirens fading into the distance. Do you believe Keanu handled the situation the right way? Should accountability for authority figures always follow misuse of power? Comment your thoughts below. Like if you believe true strength comes from calm discipline.